Mike Tyson stood in the first-class line, dressed simply, a stark contrast to the luxury around him. A man watched him with disdain, unable to hide his arrogance. What happened next would leave everyone on that plane completely speechless and forever change one life. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The Los Angeles airport was as busy as always. People coming and going, conversations blending together, and luggage rolling in all directions. In the middle of it all, a man stood calmly in the first-class line. That man was Mike Tyson. He was dressed simply, a loose-fitting shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots. He carried a backpack that looked like it had traveled the world with him. There was nothing flashy about him, and perhaps because of that, he went unnoticed. Yet anyone who took a closer look could sense something different about him. It wasn't just the way he dressed, but the quiet intensity he exuded. He seemed like someone who had learned to control his emotions, despite the chaos around him. While everyone else appeared rushed and anxious, Mike stood there, still and observant. He didn't mind the glances or the stark contrast between himself and the other passengers. Right behind him in the line was Victor Harding. Victor was the complete opposite of Mike. He wore an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that demanded attention. Every movement he made seemed rehearsed, as though he wanted the world to know he was someone important. His eyes quickly scanned the line, and when they landed on Mike, he couldn't hold back his comment. "First class, huh?" Victor said with an ironic smile. "You never know who might show up here these days." Mike turned his head and looked at him, keeping his expression neutral. "Yeah, the world is full of surprises." Victor frowned for a moment. He seemed to expect a bigger reaction, something that would confirm what he thought about the man in front of him. But Mike stayed quiet, as if the comment didn't matter. Victor decided to push further. "Look, nothing personal, but you don't seem like the type who flies like this," he said, chuckling softly. "It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." The moment to board had arrived. The first-class line began moving forward, and Mike and Victor, without exchanging any more words, followed with their tickets in hand. Victor, as usual, walked with firm, confident strides, while Mike seemed oblivious to the commotion around him, walking at the same steady pace as before. When they finally entered the plane, the unexpected happened. Upon reaching his seat, Victor checked his ticket once more, and as he looked up, he saw Mike settling into the seat right next to his. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. He sat down beside Mike and let out a low chuckle, as if the situation were a joke. Of all the places possible, it had to be here. Mike simply looked at him with that same controlled demeanor and gave a slight nod. "Looks like we're traveling together then," he replied politely. Victor crossed his arms, trying to hide his discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting next to Mike, but the thought that the man he had judged minutes ago was now sharing the same exclusive space as him. He couldn't quite explain why, but Mike's presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. As the economy-class passengers finished boarding, Victor decided to strike up a conversation, but not in a friendly way. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, with the casual tone of someone who already thought they knew the answer but wanted confirmation. Mike, who was adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up and answered simply, "I'm involved in sports." Victor raised his eyebrows, as if surprised. "Oh, I see. Small-time stuff?" Mike gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Victor laughed. "I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place, you know? But sometimes certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance." Mike looked at him for a moment, as if evaluating the situation, but maintained his unruffled demeanor. "I think we all have our place," Mike replied, "and sometimes it's exactly where we are." Victor let out a short laugh. "That's nice, kind of philosophical even, but real life isn't that simple." Mike didn't respond immediately. He just turned back to the window, as if the conversation was over. But Victor wasn't done yet. "You know what?" Victor said, leaning slightly toward him. You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never really belong to certain people. This time Mike didn't respond with words. He simply looked at him for a moment, with an expression that combined restraint and a quiet forcefulness. It was the kind of look that said more than any words ever could. Victor, realizing his provocation hadn't had the desired effect, leaned back into his seat with a satisfied smile. He thought he had the upper hand in the situation, but the truth was that things were only just beginning. Victor was convinced he was in control, but Mike's composure masked something he couldn't anticipate. With every passing minute, what seemed like a simple conversation was turning into something much bigger. With the plane already in the air, the in-flight service began. The flight attendant moved through first class, offering drinks, and Victor made sure to be noticed. "A glass of champagne, please," he said with a confident smile. "Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." The flight attendant, accustomed to demanding passengers, nodded with a professional smile. When it was Mike's turn, he made a simple request. "Just water, please." Victor didn't miss the opportunity to comment. He looked at Mike with that same air of superiority and let out a chuckle. "Water?" he asked, almost laughing. "Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience of flying first class with water." Mike took the bottle the flight attendant handed him and replied calmly, "I'm good with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor narrowed his eyes, as if trying to understand the response, but quickly decided to push back. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." Mike raised the bottle and took a small sip, not responding immediately. Other passengers began to notice Victor's provocative tone, but since Mike appeared unbothered, no one intervened. "Maybe the best is different for everyone," Mike finally said, with the same level tone as before. Victor didn't like the answer. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters. Some things are beyond the reach of certain people, you know?" The flight attendant, who was serving another passenger, cast a discreet glance in their direction as if considering stepping in. But she saw Mike was handling the situation calmly. "Well," he responded with nothing more than a measured nod, turning back to look out the window. Victor, on the other hand, wasn't satisfied. He wanted to provoke more, but was beginning to realize that Mike was a difficult opponent to rattle. Victor was convinced he was winning the dispute, but for the passengers around them, his arrogance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. While Mike remained composed, Victor was about to face a reality that would completely change his views on people. The flight attendant returned to the section of the cabin where Mike and Victor were seated. As she served another round of drinks, Victor decided to continue the conversation, or rather, his string of provocations. "You know, life is like flying first class," he began, gesturing with his champagne glass. "You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky." Mike placed his water bottle on the seat tray and finally turned to face Victor. His gaze was composed, but there was a new clarity in it, as if he was ready to speak more openly. "Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" Mike said, his tone calm but unwavering. The passengers around them, who had been discreetly observing, began to pay closer attention. The cabin was almost uncomfortably silent. A few exchanged glances, noticing the subtle clash between the two. Victor smiled, clearly trying to hide that the response had gotten to him somehow. "Well, I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here." Mike leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. "I think the value of being here," he gestured around the seat, "isn't about what you have, but how you treat others." The phrase hung in the air like an undeniable truth. Some passengers nodded slightly, while others exchanged approving glances. Victor, on the other hand, seemed uncomfortable. He tried to laugh it off, but his unease was starting to show. "That's a good one. First-class self-help philosophy," he said, attempting a sarcastic edge. "Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks." Mike offered a brief smile and turned back to face forward, ending the conversation without saying anything more. His silence carried more weight than any comeback. The passengers around them began to react quietly. Some whispered to one another, while others looked at Victor with disapproval. A couple sitting a few rows behind, who appeared to have recognized Mike, remained silent, respecting his space, but clearly admiring how he was handling the situation. Victor, meanwhile, began to notice he was being watched, and not in a positive way. His posture, once so self-assured, began to slump slightly, but he still wasn't ready to admit he had lost control. Victor thought he was winning, but the reactions around him told a different story. He didn't yet know that what was coming next would make him question everything he believed about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant passed by, collecting empty glasses, Victor seemed determined to win the debate he had started. "You know what's funny?" Victor continued. "People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Mike leaned forward slightly, looking Victor directly in the eye. "I've noticed that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside." The words lingered for a few seconds, and Victor seemed momentarily taken aback. He opened his mouth but couldn't immediately find the right words. Passengers around them exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by Mike's poise. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," Victor said, finally regaining his voice, "but the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." Mike leaned back in his seat and replied calmly, "Maybe, but I think true success doesn't need to be advertised. It speaks for itself." Mike's words seemed to resonate throughout the cabin. A few passengers nodded discreetly, while others cast disapproving glances at Victor, who clearly wasn't used to being challenged this way. By this point, the atmosphere in first class had shifted. Many passengers were now fully tuned into the exchange between Mike and Victor. An older man sitting nearby turned to observe more closely, shaking his head as if to show disapproval of Victor's behavior. Victor, aware of the stares, tried to hide his frustration, but instead of backing down, he launched another jab. "Cheap philosophy. It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way." Mike looked at him, still maintaining the same measured expression. "The real world is made by people, Victor. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else." Victor felt the shift in the room. He glanced around and realized he was no longer the one controlling the narrative. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared directly at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Victor was beginning to see that his strategy of dominance was backfiring. He thought he was leading, but Mike's words were changing people's perception, and maybe even Victor's own. The tension was palpable. Victor crossed his arms, trying to maintain composure, but his irritation was evident. Mike, however, seemed unaffected by the stares. He turned directly to Victor and spoke with a level voice. "You know, Victor, I understand what you're saying. The world can be very competitive, but I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper, an insecurity, an inner struggle." Victor furrowed his brow, uncertain whether Mike was provoking him or truly trying to have a genuine conversation. "Inner struggle?" he said, laughing. "I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong." Mike offered a slight smile and shook his head. "Maybe, but I've met many people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to fill a void." The words seemed to catch Victor off guard. He paused, fiddling with the wedding band on his finger in a moment of unspoken hesitation, but quickly returned to his defensive stance. "That's not me. Everything I've accomplished I worked hard for, and I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." Mike stayed calm, as if carefully weighing his next words. He studied Victor for a few seconds before replying. "I'm not saying you didn't earn what you have. I just think that sometimes we get so focused on showing it off that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this?" Victor tightened his lips, visibly uncomfortable. The question seemed to echo around him, but he resisted the idea that it hit a nerve. "Who are we?" he scoffed. "We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing." Mike held his gaze, his expression now more solemn. "I disagree. I think we're defined by how we treat others, not by what we accumulate. And in the end, the things we put on display matter less than what we carry inside." He tapped his chest, and his words reverberated in the quiet cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement, while Victor appeared to falter slightly. "That's easy for you to say," Victor muttered, half rising from his seat. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've gone through to get here." Mike answered calmly but firmly, without raising his voice. "You're right. I don't know your story, but I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes, when someone feels the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're hiding something. Fear, insecurity, loneliness." The accusation struck like a punch. Victor froze, his face reddening with anger and perhaps shame. He clenched his fists, as if battling an urge to retaliate. Finally losing his composure, Victor stood up abruptly, sending his empty champagne glass clattering to the floor. "You think you're better than me?" he yelled, commanding the attention of everyone in first class. "Sitting there with your clever lines, acting like you know everything about life, but you don't know the first thing about surviving in the real world." A hush fell over the cabin. The flight attendant hurried over, attempting to calm the disturbance. Mike remained seated, his gaze steady on Victor. He allowed the man to finish before responding. "I don't think I'm better than you," he said, in a composed yet unwavering tone. "I just think that sometimes we need to remember what really matters. And Victor, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone." Those final words seemed to pierce Victor's frustration. He was breathing hard, but something in Mike's voice caused him to sink back into his seat, more exasperated than furious. Victor sat silently, Mike's words echoing in his head. He had never felt so exposed before, but he still couldn't predict the moment that would truly unsettle him. The rest of the flight was cloaked in tension. Victor avoided looking at Mike, clearly disturbed by how vulnerable he felt. Mike, on the other hand, seemed at peace, as though nothing had happened. A short while later, the flight attendant approached Mike with a polite smile. Her announcement seized everyone's attention in first class. "Mr. Tyson, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Tyson seemed to ring out across the cabin. Some passengers, who had been quietly observing, now widened their eyes. A murmur rippled through first class, and that was when Victor froze. "Tyson?" he repeated, almost in disbelief. "Mike Tyson?" Mike nodded politely to the flight attendant, then turned to Victor, who stared at him like he was seeing a ghost. "Is something wrong, Victor?" Mike asked with a measured smile. Victor tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He glanced around, noticing the curious or disapproving looks from other passengers. He felt utterly lost. Victor slumped in his seat, visibly discomforted. He mumbled a few words, seemingly desperate to justify himself. I had no idea. You never said who you were," he finally blurted. "I didn't know that you were... you." Mike's voice was calm but firm. "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually lead with my name." Victor was silent for a moment, then tried to defend himself. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't know who I was talking to." Mike exhaled softly and leaned forward. "Victor, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're talking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people." "People." The word seemed to echo around Victor. He glanced at Mike, then at the onlookers, acutely aware of their judgment. His humiliation was undeniable. A new quiet settled over the cabin, broken only by Mike, who decided to conclude with one last insight. "You know, Victor, life is tough enough for everyone. We don't need to bring each other down just to feel stronger ourselves." Victor could only nod, unable to argue. For the first time, he appeared genuinely introspective about his behavior. Mike leaned back in his seat, effectively ending the conversation. Victor stayed there, staring at his hands as he replayed every word in his mind. It wasn't merely Mike he was confronting, but his own reality. In trying to belittle someone else, Victor had unmasked more about himself than he ever intended. For the rest of the flight, an uneasy hush hovered over first class. Victor, once so commanding, now looked deeply uncomfortable, scarcely meeting the eyes of those around him. The arrogance he brought on board had vanished, leaving something much closer to regret. As the minutes ticked by, Victor's thoughts churned around Mike's words. Everything Mike had said came off as simple, yet it cut to the core. Victor pondered his own actions, recalling the countless times he'd passed judgment on others without truly knowing them. Maybe he's right, Victor murmured, almost unintentionally. He threw a quick glance at Mike, who was calmly reading a magazine as if nothing unusual had occurred. It magnified the impact of the lesson. Mike hadn't tried to prove anything. He had simply let his conduct speak for itself. As the plane prepared to land, Victor summoned the resolve to speak again. Keeping his gaze lowered, he addressed Mike. I need to apologize. Not just because of who you are, but because I was acting like a jerk. I was arrogant. Mike's expression was as composed as ever. He waited a moment before replying. I accept your apology, but more importantly, I hope you learn from it. Victor inclined his head, recognizing that the moment offered a chance for genuine transformation. Then Mike added, sometimes the things we chase hardest are the very things we lack inside ourselves. I hope you figure out what truly matters. Victor stayed quiet, but Mike's words stayed lodged in his mind. He sensed that he could change if he let himself. When they disembarked, Victor lingered in the terminal, watching Mike Tyson fade into the airport crowd. He saw a few admirers timidly approach Mike for autographs or pictures, and Mike obliged each person with patience and warmth, without haste or any hint of self-importance. It was clear his modesty and kindness were genuine. Victor lowered his eyes and sighed. He knew he had to rethink his priorities. Mike's advice still echoed in his head. A reminder that true worth isn't about titles or showmanship, but about how one treats others. As Mike finally disappeared into the bustling corridor, Victor felt something unexpected. Hope. Maybe this meeting had been more than mere chance. Perhaps it was the first step toward a new way of living. In the end, we all carry choices that define who we become. Are we aiming to impress others, or striving to be better humans? Mike Tyson's words offer a powerful lesson. Real success isn't about what you achieve or flaunt, but about the impact you leave on the world and on the lives around you. So, the next time you find yourself judging someone or creating conflict, remember, respect and humility never go out of style. And maybe the world changes for the better when we decide to change ourselves. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will touch your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories filled with hope, compassion, and resilience.